In the vast tapestry of America's Gilded Age, where fortunes swelled to unimaginable heights and a new aristocracy built palatial monuments to their wealth, few structures remain as hauntingly symbolic and ultimately as tragic as Whitemarsh Hall. It was more than a mere mansion. It was an audacious, uncompromising declaration of dominance by its owner, Edward T. Stotesbury, a man whose ascent from humble origins to the pinnacle of finance at J.P. Morgan & Co. mirrored the era's grand, often brutal, trajectory of success. The architectural vision for Whitemarsh Hall was entrusted to Horace Trumbauer, the same brilliant, largely self-taught designer who had already crafted the homes of other Philadelphia magnates, but this commission was to be his magnum opus, a project of almost reckless scale and ambition. Stotesbury and his notoriously extravagant second wife, Eva, did not merely want a large house. They demanded a European palace translated onto American soil, a place that would not only house their immense collection of art and antiques, but would also eclipse the estates of their peers and rivals in size, grandeur, and cost. The location chosen was a sprawling estate near Chestnut Hill, Pennsylvania, an area already synonymous with old Philadelphia wealth. But Whitemarsh Hall was designed to redefine the very concept of estate. Groundbreaking began in 1916, but construction continued through the turmoil of World War I and into the Roaring '20s, a testament to the unhurried, perfectionist pace afforded by limitless capital. What rose from the earth was a neoclassical French chateau, drawing deep inspiration from the Palace of Versailles, specifically the architecture of the 18th century French court. The mansion spanned an astonishing 100,000 square feet, boasting 147 rooms, including 45 bathrooms, an internal postal system, a massive ballroom, a library paneled in French walnut, and a grand hall that alone rivaled the public spaces of small hotels. This was not a private residence in the traditional sense. It was a museum, a venue for state-level entertaining, and a permanent theatrical backdrop for the life Eva Stotesbury intended to live, a life of perpetual, conspicuous luxury. The detailing was obsessive: imported French limestone for the facade, rare marble shipped from Italy for the interiors, hand-carved boiserie replicating historical French designs, and gardens designed by the great landscape architect Jacques Robert, who created a formal axis stretching for nearly a mile, complete with fountains, terraces, and classical statuary. The estimated cost of construction alone surpassed $7 million in 1920s money, a figure equivalent to hundreds of millions today, making it, by some measures, the single most expensive private residence ever built in the United States up to that time. Whitemarsh Hall was therefore more than just wood and stone. It was a tangible symbol of the decade's financial euphoria, an edifice that seemed to promise that the Gilded Age and the Stotesbury fortune would last forever. Yet this very monumentality, this almost defiant disregard for scale and practicality, carried within its limestone foundations the seeds of its eventual and shockingly rapid ruin. The true spirit and operational purpose of Whitemarsh Hall were embodied less by Edward T. Stotesbury, the quiet financier who controlled the flow of capital, and more by his wife Eva Roberts Stotesbury, a figure whose ambition and social maneuvering were legendary even in an age defined by social climbers. Eva, initially from a more modest background, married the much older Stotesbury in 1912, inheriting not just his wealth, but the platform to orchestrate the most elaborate social calendar Philadelphia, and indeed the nation, had ever witnessed. Whitemarsh Hall became the physical manifestation of her societal reign, a palace where every detail, from the liveried staff of over 70 to the placement of every Renoir and Fragonard, was curated to project an image of impeccable inherited grandeur, seamlessly blending old European aristocracy with new American money. The balls and garden parties hosted within the hall's colossal walls were legendary events, not merely social gatherings, but meticulously staged exercises in power and influence, drawing titans of industry, European royalty, and political figures. Eva ensured that Whitemarsh Hall became a required stop for anyone aspiring to the highest echelons of American society, solidifying her husband's status not just in finance, but as a key cultural arbiter. The estate's gardens with their tiered fountains and classical temples served as the backdrop for these extravagant spectacles, offering a sense of timeless European elegance intended to erase the Stotesbury name's relatively recent arrival at such wealth. Eva's tireless pursuit of social perfection, however, necessitated a constant and staggering expenditure, turning the maintenance of the estate into a financial vortex. The house was not simply lived in, it was performed, requiring a monumental annual budget for upkeep, staffing, heating, and continuous acquisition of art and rare furnishings to fill its vast spaces. However, the dedication to this extravagant lifestyle coincided ominously with a period of growing economic instability. While the 1920s roared on the surface, beneath lay the structural fragility of unregulated financial markets. Edward Stotesbury, as a senior partner at J.P. Morgan, was deeply entrenched in the system that eventually overheated. The very decade that saw Whitemarsh Hall completed and reach its social zenith was the same decade that culminated in the catastrophic crash of 1929. The Stotesburys, insulated by the sheer size of their fortune, initially weathered the storm better than most. Their wealth was largely tied up in established banking interests and not entirely in speculative stocks. Yet the Great Depression did not spare anyone completely. It choked the economy, dramatically reduced the value of their holdings, and more importantly, annihilated the social and financial ecosystem that made Whitemarsh Hall sustainable. The era of limitless spending had vanished, leaving behind a palatial home that was by its very nature an anachronism, a massive, thirsty relic of a permanently bygone age of opulence. The psychological toll of maintaining such a facade while the world outside crumbled began to weigh heavily on the aging couple and the structure itself. The death of Edward T. Stotesbury in 1938 marked the true beginning of Whitemarsh Hall's long, slow, and inevitable decay. Stotesbury had lived a long life, reaching the age of 89, and his passing dissolved the core financial stability that had underpinned the mansion's entire existence. The great fortune he had amassed, though still vast, was immediately subjected to the harsh realities of inheritance taxes, which during the Depression era were punitive and inescapable. The staggering cost of inheritance, coupled with the ongoing astronomical expenses required to simply keep Whitemarsh Hall heated, staffed, and minimally maintained, a cost estimated at over $500,000 annually, even after reducing the staff, created a financial crisis that Eva Stotesbury could not ignore. The house, designed to celebrate eternal wealth, suddenly became an overwhelming liability. Eva, unwilling to relinquish her identity as the chatelaine of America's premier mansion, initially attempted to continue the facade. However, the Depression had irrevocably changed the social landscape. The grand parties became fewer, the guest lists thinner, and the sheer emptiness of the colossal structure began to feel palpable. The solution to the tax burden and the maintenance costs was brutal: the gradual, piecemeal liquidation of the very treasures Whitemarsh Hall had been built to house. Eva began selling off portions of the legendary art collection, a Rembrandt here, a Van Dyck there, quietly, systematically disassembling the inner glory of the estate to pay for its outer shell. This act of disassembling the collection was not just a financial transaction. It was a profound act of psychological surrender, acknowledging that the era of unbridled, permanent wealth was over. By 1941, faced with the increasing demands of the estate and the shifting social winds of World War II, Eva made the agonizing decision to sell Whitemarsh Hall. The problem, however, was that no private individual in the drastically changed economic climate could possibly afford to purchase and maintain such an enormous, specialized property. It was too grand for a residence, too remote for a public institution, and too expensive for a museum. The house stood as a testament to excess that the new, more sober America was unwilling to embrace. Ultimately, the property was sold not to a new millionaire, but to the Penn Mutual Life Insurance Company for a mere $450,000, a fraction of its original construction cost, to be repurposed as a training center and data repository during the war years. Eva Stotesbury retreated to her other estates in Florida and Bar Harbor, Maine, leaving the palace she had built for posterity to the utilitarian hands of a corporation. This transaction sealed the building's fate, transforming it from a priceless monument of personal ambition into a piece of disposable commercial real estate, marking its dramatic fall from grace and the end of its life as a private domain of power. The acquisition of Whitemarsh Hall by Penn Mutual Life Insurance Company signaled a stark, immediate change in the building's purpose and atmosphere. The opulent interiors, once meticulously maintained for the display of priceless art and hosting glittering social events, were rapidly converted for the pragmatic needs of a corporate entity. The grand ballroom and dining halls became large training rooms and offices. The private library and sitting rooms were used for executive meetings, and the numerous staff quarters and guest suites were adapted into dormitories for employees and storage areas for records. The very soul of the house, its original function as a stage for aristocratic life, was stripped away and replaced with the anonymous, functional aesthetic of mid-century corporate utility. This period, which spanned nearly 2 decades, saved the structure from immediate demolition, but also subjected it to a profound kind of architectural neglect. While the building was physically occupied, its new owners focused on functionality rather than conservation. The complex and expensive systems that had maintained the house, the elaborate plumbing, the massive heating system, and the delicate facade stonework, were simply too costly and specialized for routine corporate maintenance. Instead of restoring the French limestone or replacing the intricate garden statuary, Penn Mutual made expedient, often visually jarring modifications. Air conditioning units were installed without regard for the historical aesthetics. Vast stretches of the formal gardens, which required immense resources and an army of gardeners, were allowed to overgrow or were converted into low-maintenance lawns and parking lots. The formal structure and the meticulous detailing began to suffer from the slow, insidious effects of water penetration and structural wear that only limitless Gilded Age budgets could previously hold at bay. The true moment of structural peril arrived in 1957 when Penn Mutual sold the property to a real estate developer, the RDC Group Inc. This transaction removed the last vestige of corporate responsibility and placed the future of Whitemarsh Hall squarely in the hands of market forces driven by profit. The developers had no interest in preserving the mansion. Their goal was to capitalize on the valuable land, which was ideally suited for high-end residential development in the burgeoning post-war economy. They leased the estate for a short period to the American Science Foundation, which further utilized the building for light industrial and laboratory purposes, introducing elements like heavy equipment and chemical storage that were profoundly detrimental to the delicate historical interiors. However, this was merely a temporary measure, a way to generate income while the development